The night air in Los Angeles had that familiar buzz of electricity and anticipation, the kind of energy that clung to the city like perfume. It was Friday. The city was alive. And for most people, it was the perfect time to wind down, indulge, and feel important. In the heart of West Hollywood, Ember and Ash, one of the city's most talked about restaurants, was fully booked. Every seat had been reserved for weeks, every table set to perfection, every server trained to perform like clockwork. But Marcus Lane didn't walk in through the front entrance with the swagger of a celebrity or the entitlement of an owner. He slipped in through the side door, hoodie over his head, jeans worn and comfortable, blending into the crowd like any other customer looking for a good meal. That was his habit. He made a point to do this every few months. No announcement, no entourage. No one needed to know who he was because Marcus wasn't here for appearances. He was here for the truth. Years ago, after retiring from a high-octane career in film, Marcus had poured his time and money into building Ember and Ash from the ground up. It wasn't a side gig or some vanity project to keep his name in the tabloids. It was a passion born from years spent on film sets, eating garbage craft service food, dreaming of a place where real comfort and sophistication could exist on the same plate. He had handpicked every chef, tasted every item on the menu, and trained his management team to value integrity as much as efficiency. On paper, the numbers looked great. Profits were steady, reviews were glowing. The brand was expanding. But Marcus had learned long ago that spreadsheets didn't tell the full story. The soul of a restaurant didn't live in Yelp reviews or social media posts. It lived in the walk-in coolers and staff lockers, in the sighs between table turns, the laughter during pre-shift meetings, and the silence that crept in after something went wrong. That was why he walked in undercover, not to catch anyone in the act, but to listen. That night, the dining room was buzzing. The sound of clinking glasses and quiet conversations mixed with the aromas of rosemary butter and grilled sirloin. Servers moved like dancers, carrying trays of cocktails and plated entrees through the maze of tables. Couples leaned into each other over candlelight. Tourists snapped selfies near the hand-painted mural wall. It looked perfect, maybe too perfect. Marcus scanned the room from the edge, absorbing everything. From the rhythmic timing of the kitchen doors to the forced smile of a hostess who didn't quite meet his eyes. He had been in the industry long enough to recognize when something felt just a little off. The flow was good, but the energy, it was strained. There was a tension buried just beneath the surface, and Marcus Lane had learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. He just didn't know what yet. But by the end of the night, he would. Marcus moved quietly along the back of the dining room, weaving between tables with the calm familiarity of someone who had once waited tables himself. He nodded at a server as they passed, subtly watching their posture, the way they clutched the tray, the stiffness in their shoulders. Everything seemed normal at first glance, but normal wasn't what he had come for. He had learned over the years that dysfunction in a workplace didn't always announce itself with shouting or broken dishes. Sometimes it whispered. As he approached the bar, the scent of charred rosemary and melted butter gave way to something less tangible unease. It was a shift in the air, subtle but real. The kind of thing that didn't hit the senses directly, but wrapped itself around the back of the neck. Marcus paused near the hallway that led toward the kitchen and employee break room. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was years of reading rooms on movie sets or boardrooms. But something pulled him in that direction. The hallway was dimly lit, the kind of lighting meant to feel luxurious, but just barely covered the wear and tear beneath the surface. From behind the cracked door of the break room, a sound slipped through, not loud, not even obvious at first. Just a soft, muffled rhythm that didn't belong with the polished chaos of dinner service. It was the kind of sound most people would ignore, restrained, hidden, buried under the hum of ventilation and clatter of dishes. But Marcus heard it, and it stopped him in his tracks. He glanced toward the break room, the door slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of stainless steel counter and a young woman bent over it. Her hands clutched the edge like she needed it to stand. Her shoulders trembled not with dramatic sobs, but with the kind of quiet unraveling only seen when someone thought no one was watching. She was trying not to break and failing. Next to her stood a young man, another employee, his body angled close, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Marcus couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. The posture, the desperation, the fear, they told him everything. This wasn't the kind of stress that came from a tough shift. It wasn't about tips or rude customers. This was different, deeper. There was fear in the way the woman held herself, fear in the way the young man kept glancing at the door. Marcus didn't recognize either of them, but he recognized that look. He had seen it before, and once you saw it, you couldn't ignore it. He stepped away, moving back toward the bar, feigning casualness. A bartender placed a glass of water in front of him, but he barely noticed. His mind was already running. This wasn't exhaustion. This was fear of something or someone, and whatever it was, it lived inside this restaurant. He scanned the floor again. His eyes landed on the man in the navy blue dress shirt near the hostess stand, standing still, watching everything. Marcus narrowed his gaze. Something was very, very wrong. Marcus sat at the edge of the bar, his eyes scanning the dining room, but his mind remained anchored in that dim hallway and the image of the young woman clinging to the edge of the metal counter. That scene hadn't been an outburst. It hadn't been frustration from a bad tip or a tough table. It had been something quieter, darker, something that reeked of powerlessness. He had seen those signs before. In his younger days on low-budget sets where assistants were screamed at behind locked doors. In corporate meetings where silence was bought and fear was normalized. The look on that girl's face had carved a place in his memory, and it wasn't going anywhere. As he mulled it over, his gaze kept returning to the man in the navy blue dress shirt. The posture said it all. He wasn't just observing. He was inspecting, calculating, micromanaging every detail, every motion, every breath that left his employees' mouths. Marcus had hired plenty of managers in his time. He knew the difference between someone who led and someone who loomed. This man, Damien, if he remembered correctly, was the latter. He didn't carry the aura of a facilitator. He carried the scent of control. Marcus had seen it play out before, the slow erosion of dignity under a supervisor who knew how to exploit vulnerability. It always started quietly. Subtle comments, isolation, favoritism disguised as mentorship. The dangerous line between professional authority and personal manipulation blurred until employees forgot what normal even looked like. He watched as the young man from the break room reappeared, likely the same one who had tried to comfort the girl. The server walked, stiffly adjusting the notepad in his apron as he passed through the dining room, his shoulders tight, his steps rushed. He looked like someone carrying a secret. Marcus had seen that walk before. The tension in his jaw, the nervous glances toward the front of the restaurant, the way his body flinched every time Damien turned his head. This wasn't a momentary lapse in morale. It was a system of silence. Marcus rose from his stool, slowly letting his body move with purpose but not urgency. He made his way toward the server station tucked near the back, catching the employee alone, while he reorganized plates and adjusted his silverware tray. Marcus approached him not as the owner, but as someone who had once been in his shoes. Someone who had once been powerless. The conversation began with something harmless. A request for a pen. A small gesture to open the door. And just as Marcus had hoped, it worked. The boy hesitated. His body language shifted, and in those subtle tells, the truth began to bleed through. The unease, the guilt, the fear. Marcus didn't need a confession. He only needed honesty to leak around the edges. The young man's reaction to a simple question told Marcus more than any formal report ever could. A glance toward Damien, a drop of the eyes, a forced chuckle. Then finally, under his breath, the truth began to emerge. Not in full, but enough. Enough to tell Marcus what he had suspected all along. This wasn't a customer complaint. This wasn't an off night. This was about someone on the inside. Someone abusing their power in the shadows. As Marcus thanked him and stepped away, he could feel the weight of Damien's eyes on his back. The manager had noticed the interaction. The tightness in the room confirmed it. There was tension now. Something unspoken had shifted. A silent battle had begun, even if only one side knew it. Marcus stepped outside into the cool night air to collect his thoughts. The truth was forming piece by piece. Rachel wasn't just exhausted, she was being cornered. And if Damien was behind it, Marcus knew it wouldn't stop with her. Not unless someone forced it to. Marcus stood outside the restaurant, the cool air brushing across his face as he leaned against the stone wall near the alleyway. The buzz of city traffic filled the distance, but his mind remained fixed on the events unfolding within the walls of his own business. It was surreal, almost disorienting how something so wrong could hide in plain sight, camouflaged by good lighting, crisp uniforms, and a 5-star rating. Inside, Ember and Ash hummed with curated elegance. Outside, Marcus was preparing for a confrontation he hadn't seen coming. He wasn't a stranger to confrontation. His entire career had been built on knowing when to push and when to pause, how to read a room, how to sense pressure before it cracked. And what he felt now was undeniable. Something wasn't just off, it was rotten. A rot that had been carefully buried beneath layers of professionalism and fear. And it had a name, Damien Rusk. The signs were all there. The trembling in Rachel's hands, the anxious glance from the young server, the too casual surveillance Damien maintained over every corner of the floor. Marcus hadn't needed a dramatic outburst or formal complaint to know what was happening. He had seen too much over the years, watched too many people fold under the weight of abuse cloaked in authority. But what made this worse, what made this personal, was that it had happened under his roof. He needed more than suspicion. He needed truth. Undeniable, irrefutable truth. And then, as if the universe had heard the silent call, the bartender from earlier stepped outside for a break. Marcus recognized the young man immediately. His name tag had read Nate, and he had served him a glass of water with a kind but weary smile. Now, away from the noise, Nate stood alone near the back door, scrolling through his phone, looking like any overworked employee stealing a moment of peace. Marcus seized the chance. The interaction that followed wasn't confrontational. It didn't need to be. He approached with casual body language, leaned against the wall beside Nate, and engaged him in quiet conversation. It started with simple observations about the night, the rush, the chaos of Fridays. But Marcus knew how to guide a conversation. He read people the way a conductor reads music, and slowly, carefully, he directed it toward Damien. Nate hesitated at first, unsure of what could be said or should be said. But the moment the name was mentioned, something shifted. A flicker in his expression, a brief darkening of the eyes. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to helplessness. And Marcus recognized it for what it was, the look of someone who had seen too much and said too little for far too long. The words didn't come all at once. They arrived slowly, wrapped in qualifiers and careful pauses. Nate wasn't sure what Marcus knew or who he really was, but instinct pushed him forward anyway. And when he finally opened up, the pieces began to fall into place. Rachel, it turned out, was often the last employee to leave, always scheduled for the closing shift even when it made no sense. Damien had a habit of keeping her behind after hours under vague pretenses, recounting registers, cleaning areas that had already been cleaned, going over schedules that had already been posted. And he always did it privately behind a closed office door in ways that made Rachel visibly uncomfortable. Nate had never heard anything outright, but the pattern was undeniable. The looks, the tension, the way Rachel's demeanor shifted whenever Damien entered the room. It wasn't just creepy, it was deliberate. Marcus listened carefully, his jaw tight. It wasn't only about Rachel. Nate admitted that others had noticed too. They talked about it in whispers during cigarette breaks or after double shifts. But no one had ever said anything aloud, not to HR, not to corporate, not even to Marcus. Fear kept them in place. Not the fear of Damien's words, but the fear of what would happen if they pushed back. Hours could be cut, schedules reshuffled. Terminations could be justified under the language of performance metrics. The system had been built to protect people like Damien. Marcus felt it deep in his chest, that slow burn of betrayal. Not just from Damien, but from the structure that allowed him to exist. The layers of hierarchy, the processes that had been set in motion with the best intentions, now twisted and used to keep people silent. The weight of it settled like lead in his gut. He thanked Nate with a simple gesture, no fanfare. Then he turned back toward the restaurant, the tension in his shoulders now laced with clarity. What had started as a routine check-in had evolved into something else entirely. He wasn't just dealing with a difficult manager, he was confronting a predator, a man who thrived in the shadows of authority, cloaked by the assumption of leadership. Marcus stepped inside again, the sound of the restaurant muffling behind the heavy door. The dinner rush was slowing. Tables were clearing. The air, once bustling, now carried a different hum, a stillness waiting to be broken. Damien stood near the server station, arms folded, eyes watching everything. He hadn't moved much all night, like a spider waiting at the center of its web. Marcus didn't approach Rachel right away. He watched her instead. Her movements, her tone, the way her eyes flickered toward Damien every few minutes. She moved with practiced professionalism, but something about it was robotic, disconnected. Like she was surviving her shift one step at a time. She didn't know he had heard her. She didn't know help had arrived. But Marcus wasn't leaving until she did. He waited for the right moment, not out of caution, but out of respect. He didn't want to cause a scene. He wanted to restore her control, not take it from her again. The moment came when she stepped away from a table, her tray empty, her hands trembling just slightly. Marcus approached slowly, gently, his presence non-threatening but direct. Rachel tensed, surprised to see him so close. And then he told her with no spectacle, no performance, that she wasn't alone. He watched her freeze. Just for a second. The mask slipped. The fear, the disbelief, the fragile hope. It was all there, flickering behind her eyes. And in that moment, Marcus understood something deeper than any policy manual or ethics code could ever teach. Sometimes what people need more than protection is proof that someone is willing to stand beside them. Rachel stood still, processing. Damien saw it. And just like that, the balance of power in Ember and Ash began to shift. Marcus didn't hesitate. Once Rachel knew she wasn't alone, there was no turning back. The brief flicker of hope in her eyes had been enough to confirm that what she needed most wasn't another apology, but an ally with authority. And that was exactly who he intended to be. The air inside Ember and Ash had grown still. Though the restaurant was slowly transitioning from the chaos of dinner to the calm of closing, the tension among the staff lingered like humidity after a storm. Damien hadn't moved from his usual position near the server stations. He stood with practiced confidence, hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes scanning every detail like a general overseeing a battlefield. He still believed he was in control. That illusion wouldn't last much longer. Marcus walked toward Rachel, who stood stiffly at the edge of the dining room, her body half turned away from her manager. She had just stepped back from a table and was straightening the edge of her apron when Marcus gently got her attention. He kept his tone steady, his voice low, making sure only she could hear him. Her posture shifted slightly, surprised but alert. He leaned in just enough to offer quiet reassurance, no threats, no commands. Just the truth. He told her who he was. Rachel's expression froze for a second, then changed. Disbelief collided with realization, and her shoulders rose with a sharp inhale before slowly sinking. A wave of quiet relief washed over her. She blinked rapidly, grounding herself in the moment. For the first time all night, she stood taller. Marcus didn't need a thank you. The way her gaze steadied was enough. Damien noticed the shift almost immediately. His chin lifted, his body straightened. He began walking toward them, a forced calm written all over his face. He was used to diffusing tension used to controlling narratives before they spun beyond his grasp. But this time the narrative wasn't his to control. Marcus turned toward him, fully stepping between Damien and Rachel, not with aggression, but with unmistakable authority. The presence he had kept hidden all evening now surfaced. No longer a bystander, no longer a passive observer. He reached into his jacket, retrieved his credentials, and made it clear who he was. The atmosphere changed instantly. The surrounding staff paused mid-step. Conversations died. Plates stopped clattering. Even the customers nearby sensed something larger unfolding. A hush spread across the floor like the ripple of a dropped glass in a silent room. Damien froze, his face drained of color, and for the first time that evening the mask cracked. The usual poise he wore like armor faltered. He tried to speak to salvage control, but Marcus was already walking toward the back office, leaving no room for negotiation. He didn't need a confession. He had the evidence, the testimonies, the recording, the silence from witnesses who had seen too much for too long. Rachel remained where she was, trembling slightly, her hands now free from the apron's tension. The staff looked toward her, then toward Marcus disappearing down the hallway with Damien reluctantly trailing behind. None of them had ever seen this before, an owner stepping in not to defend the brand, but to defend a single voice that had gone unheard. Behind the closed office door, power shifted. When Marcus finally returned to the dining room, Damien was gone, and everyone knew it. Rachel stood at the edge of the floor, eyes searching his face. Marcus nodded once, a simple gesture that said everything without words. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It wasn't fearful. It was cleansing. For the first time, the restaurant exhaled. The office at the back of Ember and Ash had always been quiet. A small, windowless room tucked behind the kitchen where operations were managed, schedules were finalized, and private meetings took place. It was meant to be a space of leadership, a place for decisions that kept the restaurant running. But as Marcus stepped through the door with Damien trailing behind him, the room felt more like a holding cell, a box where truths could no longer hide behind pleasantries and performance reviews. Marcus closed the door behind them with finality. The dull click of the latch was sharper than it should have been, louder in the silence that followed. Damien stood stiffly near the desk, attempting to gather himself, clinging to whatever semblance of professionalism he still believed he had. He tried to manage his posture, tried to appear unbothered, but Marcus could see right through it. The confidence was a costume now unraveling at the seams. Marcus didn't sit. He didn't need to. Instead, he planted both hands on the desk, leaned forward, and let the silence press in. The weight of it suffocated any attempt at pretense. He didn't need theatrics. He had come armed with the truth, and that was heavier than any accusation. From his pocket, he produced his phone and pressed play. The recording was short, but it didn't need to be long. Rachel's voice, trembling and honest, filled the room. Then Noah's, urgent and protective. It wasn't a script. It wasn't embellished. It was real. The rawness of it was unmistakable, and there was no explaining it away. Damien's expression shifted. First surprise, then denial, then desperation. His shoulders tightened. His hands fidgeted. He opened his mouth more than once, but couldn't seem to find a place to land. His attempts to speak fell flat, hollow, and clumsy against the weight of what had just been heard. Marcus remained steady, unmoved. He had no interest in justifications. The reality was clear. This had been going on for some time. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misread interaction. It was a pattern, manipulative, predatory, and sustained. Marcus had seen enough to know what kind of man Damien was. And more importantly, he had seen what kind of fear that behavior had created in his staff. Marcus reached for his phone again, not to threaten, but to act. With quiet, resolute clarity, he dialed the number that mattered most. There would be no HR report, no second chances. This wasn't a performance issue. This was a moral failure, a betrayal of everything Marcus had built, of the trust he had placed in someone to lead with decency. Damien sat back, stunned, his face drained of whatever color remained. He wasn't just losing his position. He was being stripped of the power he had abused. And for the first time in that small office, he seemed to realize it. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned, stepped away from the desk, and opened the door. The conversation was over. The reckoning had come and gone, quiet but absolute. Damien remained seated, unable to follow the door closing behind Marcus like the final period at the end of a sentence written in ink. When Marcus re-entered the main floor, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't celebratory, not yet, but something had been lifted. A silence broken. A grip released. The damage had been done, but the healing finally could begin. When Marcus stepped back into the dining room, the difference in the air was subtle but unmistakable. The kind of shift that didn't require words. It was in the way the servers moved less rigid, less rehearsed. In the way Rachel stood behind the host stand, not cowering, not bracing, but simply breathing. The oppressive presence that had loomed over the restaurant for so long had been removed. And for the first time in far too long, the team felt it. Damien was gone. The staff didn't celebrate, but they didn't need to. His absence was its own announcement. No one asked questions because they already knew the answers. They had lived them in silence. Each of them had felt the weight of working under someone who blurred the lines between authority and control. And though it was Rachel who had endured the worst, her story was not isolated. It was a reflection of a system that had allowed fear to grow in the quiet spaces between shifts behind closed doors and under the fluorescent lights of a break room no one wanted to linger in. Marcus stood before the team not as a celebrity or an owner, but as someone willing to look them in the eye. He didn't need to raise his voice to command their attention. They were already listening, waiting, hoping. He didn't speak to them as a group of employees. He spoke to them as people who had spent too many nights feeling powerless, who had become experts at hiding discomfort behind practiced smiles. He acknowledged the pressure, the culture of silence, the fear that had shaped their daily routines. And then, with deliberate calm, he told them the truth. Things would change. Not just the manager, the system. The restaurant was entering a new chapter, one where power would no longer be protected behind titles and closed doors. It wasn't about a single bad apple. It was about recognizing that good environments don't create themselves. They're built deliberately, actively, and continuously by people who are willing to listen. Rachel didn't speak right away, but when she did, it wasn't from a place of fear. It was from resolve. She didn't want pity. She wanted assurance that no one else would ever feel what she had felt, that her silence hadn't been in vain. Others followed. Noah stepped forward, his voice firm. Kara, the bartender, added her own truth. Tyler, one of the younger servers, shared how close he had come to quitting, how often he had told himself that enduring it was just part of the job. But now, with the silence broken, the stories poured out. Not loud, not theatrical, just honest. They had been waiting for permission to speak. Now they had it. And as they spoke, something powerful began to take shape. Not just trust, but unity. They weren't victims. They were survivors. And more than that, they were ready to become builders. Of a workplace that didn't reward silence. Of a culture that didn't confuse fear with respect. Marcus didn't interrupt. He didn't steer the conversation. He simply stood there, allowing it to unfold, allowing it to be theirs. That he understood was the difference between a leader and a figurehead. A figurehead guards structure. A leader listens, adapts, and protects people first. As the night wore on, the staff slowly returned to their duties, but they did so differently now. With glances exchanged, shoulders lifted, a shared sense of something reclaimed. Marcus watched them, not with pride, but with responsibility. Because what had happened here tonight wasn't just about removing a problem. It was about choosing what kind of place Ember and Ash would be going forward. Liberation wasn't loud. It was quiet. A breath long held, finally released. It didn't come with applause. It came with change. The next morning, long before the restaurant reopened, Marcus returned to Ember and Ash. The dining room was quiet now, stripped of its evening energy. Tables were bare chairs pushed in, and sunlight filtered through the high windows in gentle shafts of gold. It was a space paused between chapters, waiting to be rewritten. Marcus walked the floor slowly, not out of habit, but with intention. Every step was a reminder of how much trust had been misplaced, how many cracks had formed in places no report had ever revealed. The night before had exposed more than a manager's abuse. It had illuminated a system that had allowed it to survive. He knew it wasn't enough to remove a problem. He had to build something better in its place. The hours that followed were filled with action, not statements, not slogans, but structure. Calls were made, audits scheduled, feedback systems redesigned, employee protections expanded, anonymous reporting channels activated, external consultants brought in not for branding but for rebuilding culture from the inside out. But more important than the policies were the people. Marcus made it clear transparency was no longer optional, and silence would never again be the cost of keeping a job. The days of looking away were over. The era of listening had begun. Ember and Ash would not become another cautionary tale. It would become a model, a place where accountability and empathy weren't in conflict but in partnership. And as the team returned one by one for their shifts, there was no grand speech waiting. Just a quiet understanding that things would be different now, not perfect but honest. And from honesty, something lasting could finally grow. Later that evening, long after the last customer had left and the lights had dimmed to their resting glow, Marcus sat alone in his car parked just across the street from Ember and Ash. From the driver's seat, he watched as the last few employees trickled out through the side door, their jackets slung over tired shoulders, their conversations quieter than usual, but free from the weight they had carried for so long. Rachel stepped out last. Her stride wasn't hurried, her head wasn't bowed. She walked beside Noah and Nate, her posture light, but grounded, the subtle movements of someone beginning to remember what it felt like to be safe. Marcus watched them disappear into the darkened city streets, their silhouettes slowly fading into the night. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. What had happened inside that restaurant would never make the headlines. There would be no viral clips, no dramatic exposes. But he knew without question that something important had shifted. Not just for Rachel or for the staff, but for himself. For too long, leadership had been measured in margins and metrics, but tonight had reminded him of a truth that numbers couldn't express. A business was only as strong as its people felt protected. No mission statement could fix what silence allowed to fester. And silence had festered here, quiet, corrosive, and tolerated for too long. Marcus thought about the years he had spent building the place, the branding, the team, the philosophy behind every dish and design choice. But it wasn't until tonight that he understood what his role truly required. Not just vision, not just execution, but presence. Not the kind that arrives with cameras and applause, but the kind that listens, the kind that notices when something feels off, and the kind that refuses to walk away when others are too afraid to speak. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was found in moments of courage, in a hand reaching across fear, in a voice deciding to speak up when silence seemed safer, in a leader choosing to protect what truly mattered people. That night, Marcus didn't celebrate. He didn't reflect with satisfaction. Instead, he committed to something harder and more enduring: to show up, to listen, to question even what seemed fine. Because injustice never introduced itself with a warning. It crept in unnoticed and stayed where power went unchallenged. The restaurant would recover, the people would heal, the system would change, and Marcus would remember. Because when justice finally speaks, it doesn't ask for applause. It simply demands that you listen and act.